Good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Marshall and I'm from the Training Accreditation Council Secretariat, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this workshop, Understanding Training Packages. This workshop forms part of the Training Accreditation Council's education program and is our final workshop of the year. The workshop today aims to provide practical information exploring the components of a training package and how to interpret them. A recording of today's session will be provided in the week following the session and on TAC's website, www.tac.wa.gov.au, under the TAC Education Program page. Before we commence this morning, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Whadjuk people on whose land we record today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Russell Docking. As you may know, Russell has been an auditor with TAC for many years. He is extremely knowledgeable on the topic presented today, and if you have a question, we please ask that you pop that in the chat box and Russell will do his best to answer as we go. Well, without further delay, I welcome Russell to deliver today's workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and welcome to you all. We have a most extraordinary number of people participating today, so it's really wonderful to have you sharing with us this important topic of understanding training packages. The training packages, the function of a training package is to communicate standards to you, and so your interpretation of the detail within a training package is really important to your work as a trainer in the vet sector. So what we're going to cover in this workshop, well, for a start, we're going to look at qualifications and how qualifications are specified. So that we'll be seeing that the first thing that training packages tell us about is that. Then we're going to look at units of competency and what they include. We're going to look at guidance and support and provide guidance and support for the use of training packages. And then we will finish off our session looking briefly at accredited courses and at transition and scope. So we begin with we'll begin with that sort of fundamental question of just what is a training package. And one of my favourite quotes is that way back in 1998, when training packages have been around for some time, it was interesting to see that there was confusion, and it was in part because the word training package has the word training in it, and people then assumed that that meant that the function of a training package was to tell you how to train, and it doesn't. Its function is primarily to tell you what outcomes the training need to lead towards, and to tell you what assessment needs to be done in order to determine if a person or a student or a learner has achieved those outcomes. So it constitutes a significant shift, the training package, from being curriculum-based, where it talks about what you're going to put into the learning, but is very imprecise about what comes out of the learning, to the idea of competency and of training package, where the focus is in what it comes out of the learning, and you as a trainer and assessor need to make decisions about what goes into the learning in order for those things to be achieved. So what we can see is that a training package is indeed not a curriculum but a standards package. It's talking about the outcomes of the process, not the inputs to the process. So when we look at the training package, we are looking at a standards package, which includes standards in relation to qualifications in terms of what are core and elective units that make up a qualification. And we're looking at the detail of the units of competency and what makes up those aspects in terms of skills and in terms of knowledge. It really is always important, though, to understand that the purpose of a unit of competency is to enable a person to perform effectively in the workplace. And the units of competency are derived from workplace analysis. They're derived from an understanding of what goes on in workplaces. These units of competency are then cobbled together to form qualifications, which are recognisable against a national standard called the Australian Qualifications Framework, which determines whether it's a Certificate 1 or a Certificate 2 or a diploma or whatever as a qualification. But it's important that you don't think of units only in terms of qualifications. It's really important that you also think of units of competency in terms of their workplace implications and their workplace meanings. And that is, again, one of the characteristics of VET that sets it apart from higher education. In higher education, the qualification looks back and says, over a period of time, you have done this learning, and therefore we award you with this qualification. In VET, we look forwards and we say, because you've got this qualification, you are now ready to work. So one looks back over the past, a traditional higher education degree, but in VET, we look to the future and say, you are now ready for work. So that workplace focus is really significant within the VET context. And when we look at training packages, we've got to keep reminding ourselves that there's the workplace that is the driver of this training package. So we start off by looking at the components of a training package. And we can think of it as three groups of components. There are units of competency, and hopefully you've got a good deal of familiarity with a range of units that you deliver. And those units of competency produced as two documents. We'll come back to this in a moment. One which provides you with the sort of elements and performance criteria and foundation skills, and the other which provides you with assessment requirements, although embedded in the assessment requirements is also the knowledge component. So when we talk about a unit of competency, we talk about skills and knowledge. For some reason or other, the skills are in one document and knowledge is in a different document, but we must always treat them as together. So within the training package, you find lists of units of competency, and you find the details of units of competency. The units of competency can then be grouped together in various ways. I'm looking here at the Certificate 3 in Civil Construction. And the Certificate 3 in Civil Construction has 8 specialisations plus 1 general civil construction qualification. So there are 9 different ways in which units of competency are clustered together to reflect 9 different ways in which competency in civil construction can be used. And so what you find when you look at the training package is first a sort of general description of what the qualification is about, and it talks about the fact that this prepares a person to work as skilled operators within civil construction workplaces. You'll find that it also talks about entry requirements, and so it actually says that there are no entry requirements in this case. It then tells you what sort of specialisations the training package might cover, and then it tells you how those specialisations are made up through different collections of units of competency. And we'll come back to that in a little bit more detail and a bit later on. And then you will also find within the, particularly the older training packages, you'll find that there are assessment guidelines. These have been mostly now written into the assessment requirements of units of competency, but in the older training packages, assessment guidelines was a separate part of the endorsed components of a training package. So you may still be dealing with some of those, others you might not. When we look at this particular training package though, and this is the one I'm holding here, interestingly enough, I'm dealing here with RII 30920, which is the next version on, but it's an equivalent qualification to the one that you can see on the screen. But you can see, if you see the screen there, or if I hold this up, that there are packaging rules for a whole collection of specialisations. And we will come to look at those in a moment. But the illustration just reflects the fact that this is a multifaceted, multi-dimensional document. And indeed, the document I'm holding now, which is the latest version of that qualification, is no less than 26 pages long. Many of the pages are devoted to lists of units of competency, clustered under groups, and we'll come back to that notion in a bit later on. And then on the back, it provides information about prerequisites. There are very few in this area, but there are some, and it lists the units that have prerequisites and what those prerequisites are. It lists specializations, and we know that there are 9, and it indicates that when you're certificating, a person may well, that you would include the detail of that specialization on the certificate. And it talks about qualification mapping, which tells you that this one I'm holding supersedes but is equivalent to the certificate that is shown there on your screen. So what you can see is that in these 26 pages which define a particular qualification, there is a lot of significant information. So let's have a look at that information in a little bit more detail. First of all, you need to know that the information on the front cover, and indeed the next page, describes the qualification as a Certificate 3 in something. And Certificate 3 comes from the Australian Qualifications Framework, and it tells you a good deal about the level of sophistication of the qualification. There is a TAC fact sheet which gives you some further information about the Australian Qualifications Framework and about units of competency. So if you want to follow up on detail in relation to this, please go to the TAC fact sheet to get some more information. But fundamentally, Certificate 3, in old-fashioned terms, is something around about trade level. AQF1, the lowest level within the AQF framework, is entry level, where a person is fundamentally carrying out very simple tasks under direct supervision. They're making very few decisions on their own. They're taking direct guidance as they go. By Certificate 3 level, this level, the person is operating reasonably autonomously. But it does make the point on various occasions that there are limitations to the level of autonomous operation, even at Certificate 3 level. As you move up through Certificate 4 and Diploma and to Advanced Diploma level, there's less and less management of the individual. Indeed, the individual will be playing more and more of a management kind of role. So you can see that the AQF level assigned to a qualification tells you a lot about the sophistication of that qualification. Then as we dig into it, we find that there are packaging rules. And this basically says that there are core units of competency and elective units of competency that make up the qualification. In this case, there is a small group of core units which every specialisation must include. And then when you get into the specialisations themselves, then those specialisations are represented through the elective units. And if we look at the first one that I have here, it's talking about a Certificate 3 in civil construction, a bituminous surfacing. It's made up of 25 units. 8 of them are the core units that every qualification in this set of specialisations involves. And then there are 17 elective units. And then it tells you where those elective units must come from. And it talks about that in terms of 4 must be chosen from a Group A or Group B. 9 can be chosen from Group C, and so on. And further on in the document, you'll find those units listed under Group A, Group B, Group C, and so on. And in that way, you can construct a qualification that first reflects the general standards of civil construction through the core, then reflects a specialisation such as bituminous surfacing through your selection of electives. But even within that selection of electives, there are opportunities to contextualise and customise, for that matter, the qualification to meet your client needs and the circumstances that within which you are working. So you can see that there is within this Certificate 3 in civil construction a high level of consistency, particularly through the core, and also a high level of flexibility, particularly through the specialisations and the electives selected within those specialisations. At the back of the document is other information. And in this particular case, the other information here relates to prerequisite units. And so there are a small number, around about 8 or so units of competency in the entire field of this qualification that have prerequisites. And so it lists the unit in the qualification and then states what the prerequisite is. And that, of course, that means that you have to consider prerequisites in your teaching. You need to make sure that prerequisites are delivered to an individual or a cohort of students prior to the units for which they are prerequisites. And they need to succeed in those prerequisites before they can succeed in the units for which they are prerequisites. So that has an implication in terms of the sequencing of the training delivery that you're doing. So you can see that a qualification has very significant information that enables you to plan and put together a qualification that is both reflective of industry standards and requirements, but also enables you to reflect specialisations and to be able to reflect needs of the locality in which you're placed. This document is part of the endorsed training package. In other words, as it's endorsed, it means that it is telling you what you must do. You can't leave a core unit out. You must teach it and deliver it, or a person must have credit for it. But whichever way it goes, a person cannot be awarded the Certificate 3 unless the pattern of units that they've achieved matches the pattern of units in that qualification. But you're also provided with advice through non-endorsed components. And so there's a companion volume for the training package from which the Certificate 3 in Civil Construction comes, and it's called the RII Resources and Infrastructure Industry Training Package Companion Volume. You need to make sure that you're using the right implementation guide. So the training package version I'm working with now is 7.1, so I make sure I'm using the companion volume implementation guide version 7.1. And within this, you'll find that in different industry areas with different training packages, there are different contents because they each express their own needs as an industry in their own way. And so in this particular case, as in most cases, you'll find that there is a list of qualifications, units of competency and prerequisites. There will usually be superseded qualifications and declarations of whether or not old qualifications have equivalence to new. There'll be a list of units of competency that have been superseded, and it'll indicate to you whether or not those superseded units are equivalent to current units. And that's something which we'll touch on briefly at the end of our session. There may be workplace requirements. There aren't in this particular one listed any particular workplace requirements, but if there are, it'll be talked about. So in the health training package, they talk about the workplace requirements involved with specific units of competency or with whole qualifications and how these need to be managed. Then may be reference to skill sets as distinct from qualifications. Collections of units of competency that make up a skill set rather than a whole qualification, and they'd be talked about within the context of the implementation guide. Pathways through from lower levels to upper levels and in and out of the training package may also be talked about. Entry requirements, and although there are no entry requirements for the Certificate 3 in Civil Construction, there are entry requirements for other qualifications in the training package, and they'll be talked about. And then any regulatory and licensing requirements, and usually what they will do is simply refer you to the state or territory agency that you would need to approach in order to identify regulatory and licensing arrangements. They don't usually spell it out in detail, but they do remind you that within many cases, activities within the defined in terms of the training package may need to meet regulatory and licensing requirements both in the training and that might also apply beyond the training, and there might also be licensing and regulatory requirements in relation to assessors and trainers and assessors. So you'll find a discussion of that, and then finally there may well be a discussion of foundation skills. Now, the example that I have here doesn't have all of those headings. Indeed, it has a few others. For example, it talks about key features of training, of the training package and the infrastructure industry. So it provides a bit of a narrative, bit of a chat about the industry, because it's trying to set this in context. There's even a section called Looking to the Future, where it talks about future developments that are likely in civil construction. And although they don't impact directly on the training package and the units of competency now, that's a reflection of what is needed now, by writing in a discussion and a narrative about the future, it forewarns you about the sort of future versions of the training package. Because at the end of the day, of course, you are training your students for a future, and not just for now, but also for the future. So they want to make sure that the people utilising the training package have an eye on the future when they are delivering training and assessment to the students. So you can see that these companion volumes are very idiosyncratic. They differ very significantly from one training package to another. But they do provide really good guidance. But I do want to stress that they are only providing guidance. They are not endorsed, and therefore what's within them is not mandated unless the same information occurs in the endorsed component. So, for example, when it's talking about prerequisites in the implementation guide, you might think that that's not endorsed and therefore not mandatory, but then you do find it in the training package, which is endorsed and therefore is mandatory. You'll also find not only the reference to these prerequisites within the training package in the qualification structure, but you'll also find reference to that within the units of competency themselves, which of course are also part of the endorsed component. So the training package provides you with a rich source of information, and it really is critical for you, even if you're delivering just one unit of competency, to go back to the training package and see how that unit of competency fits into a whole qualification or even a number of qualifications. It's quite possible that the unit is used by a lot of qualifications, and how that qualification relates to industry and ultimately to a person's role within industry. So it's really critical that you do that and that you get yourself immersed a bit into the implementation guide, because that companion volume does tell you quite a lot of very useful information that again helps you with the context of what you're doing. But when we get to the next part of the training package, we find ourselves looking at detailed information about units of competency. And indeed, I should mention, of course, that you can get all of this information from training.gov. If you tap in the code of a qualification, it'll bring up a list of resources and information. It'll tell you some providers and so on, but you need to go to training.gov. And when you go to training.gov, you will find that you can get access to all of this information. You can get access to the training package as a whole, to particular qualifications, and of course within that through links you can go straight to units of competency themselves, and you can print them out or just review them on screen. But all of this information is readily available to you when you move into the training package. But the core component of a training package is, or the core components of a training package which build qualifications or units of competency. So we need to just reflect briefly before we start looking at what is in a training package and what detail is provided in the unit of competency, to the general idea of what a competency is and what a unit of competency is. And the standards in the glossary in the standards for RTO are really good in respect to this. So if we just take the definition apart bit by bit, Competency means the consistent application of knowledge and skill. Consistent application tells you that it's not generally a one-shot thing. You need to know, are they consistent? And it says application. So we're not talking about just knowing stuff. They've got to be able to use that knowledge and use the skill. And they need to be able to use it consistently. That's telling you a lot about how you teach and about how you assess. But what is the purpose of this knowledge and skill is to be able to perform in the workplace. And so the standard of performance of the workplace is critical. That tells you that you need to go to your experience, your current industry skills, to understand how workplaces use this competency. And that'll be a theme we come back to again and again today, but also in the activity that we'll have a look at in around about 25 minutes' time. Fundamentally, though, what we are always asking ourselves is how is this knowledge and how is this skill utilised in the workplace? And then it embodies the ability to transfer and apply skills and knowledge to new situations and environments, which again means that we are not teaching a person just how to do one thing in one way. We need to talk about how that competency, those skills and the knowledge can be applied in different circumstances with different equipment, for example, or different resources, or different work sites, or within different companies. And sometimes those companies might be working with slightly archaic equipment, and your graduates need to be able to cope with that. Or they might be working with state-of-the-art equipment, in which case your graduates need to be able to cope with that. So the transfer is a critical component. Otherwise, what you are doing is not training them for all of the possible opportunities that exist. You're training them for just one narrow perception of what that industry involves. And that does mean that you do need to spend a lot of time making sure that you have your current industry knowledge and skills really well managed, so that you are conscious of what is happening within industry right now. And again, have an eye on the future as to what might be going to happen with industry in the future. But also remember the past, because quite often an individual will be utilising these competencies you're delivering in an environment which is not yet state-of-the-art or utilising the latest technology. So competency is this quality. It's a quality, I might say, of the person. It's not a quality of the course. It's not a quality of the assessments. It's a quality of the person. And the course's function is to develop that quality within the person, and the function of assessment is to verify that that quality has been acquired by the person. But it's that quality of competency that they then take into the workplace to become an effective functioning member of within the workplace, leading to constructive and productive and safe outcomes within the workplace. Competencies then as an idea has broad application. It applies, of course, to training, and it applies, of course, to assessment, but it also applies to workplace activities. And that is one of the strengths of VET, is that there is this seamless connection between what happens in workplaces and what happens in training. And that is one of the virtues of the vocational education training program, and why we have training packages and why we have units of competency. It's to build people towards that workplace world. The unit of competency is the way we specify what is actually required in terms of the workplace. And so when we get into the unit of competency, we will see that there are two documents. It's been a mystery to most as to why there are two documents, because these absolutely have no meaning as separate documents. The first document, in this particular case, it's for a unit of competency called Conduct Civil Construction Excavator Operations. I might say, by the way, that it's got a rather old-fashioned code because it is not yet the latest version of the unit of competency. There's an F on the end, which tells you that it hasn't got the latest coding. You'll also notice it starts with 3220 because the 3 means it's a Certificate 3 unit. Now, I want to stress here that it is not a Certificate 3 in the AQF sense, in that the unit it doesn't have an AQF level. What it's telling you is that this is a unit of that kind of sophistication. So you would expect to find this unit of competency popping up in a Certificate 3. It could pop up in a Certificate 4, but you'd still teach it at a Certificate 3 level. So the 3 in the 3TO actually tells you a little bit about the level. And I might say that on the back page of the second document, which is the assessment requirements, it has a triple asterisk which says, while the unit of competency does not have an AQF level, where a unit is being delivered outside of a qualification, the first numeric character of the unit code should be considered as an AQF indicator level for assessment purposes. I think Claire talks about this as a hint as to the AQF level of the unit. So there's a little acknowledgement in the actual document that that code number 3 tells you something about how sophisticated this unit of competency will be. But you have to read these two documents together. The first one provides you with a range of information which is meaningless without the second, because, and I might say, strangely enough, that since a unit of competency is made up of knowledge and skills, we have the skills in one document and we have some skills and knowledge in the other document, and you must always treat them together as one document. So what's in a unit of competency? Let's just take a walk through, and we're just going to take a walk through quickly now and then take a look at each of these in a little bit more detail. The first thing is that there's a unit code, an AQF level, and perhaps I should put that in inverted commas because we've already just agreed that there isn't an AQF level for a unit. It's an AQF level hint or clue, and a title. It's important to see that the code tells you something about the training package from which this comes. So the first 3 letters in the unit I'm looking at are RII, which tells you it comes from the RII, which is the Resources and Infrastructure Industry Training Package. So that tells you where it comes from. And then there's an MPO, which tells you that we're now talking about a particular part of that industry. And then there's a 0320, I beg your pardon, MPO 320, which tells you, in this particular case, a hint about the AQF level. F at the end of this tells you that it's a particular version of the unit. And then there's the title, which tells you what it's about. And it's really important that the unit of competency is talking about what a person's capable of doing. So this is saying that a person is able to conduct civil construction excavator operations in this case. So you can put the words able to in front of it. It's not a subject, it's not a topic, it's a competency. So it's talking about the person and what the person can do. And so there's that verb at the front, conduct. Conduct civil construction excavator operations tells you what a person will be able to do when they have achieved this unit of competency. When we get into the unit of competency, we discover that there is a whole, we might just move to the next slide. So we've talked about the unit code, AQF level and title. I do want to stress here that when you read this code, AQF level and title, you need again to draw on your industry skills because that's critical to your understanding of what this unit of competency means. In other words, if these words don't mean anything to you, so conduct civil construction excavator operations, you shouldn't be trying to work with this unit of competency. It should be something that you recognise as not only part of your skill set, but also how that fits into the civil construction world, because and that is drawing very heavily on your industry skills. It does mean that, and it is why in the standards for RTOs, in standard 1.5 and 1.6, it talks about you engaging with industry to enhance your industry skills and to make sure that what you deliver is relevant to industry's needs and reflects industry practices, and why in standard 113B, you are asked to make sure that you can demonstrate that you do have current industry skills. Those are all very important for your task of interpreting a unit of competency. So let's now look a little bit more deeply into this. We get now to the next part of a unit of competency, and we get now to the application. And the application describes how the unit is actually used in industry and how it can be applied. And it tells you what graduates will do once they've achieved the competency and are in the workplace. And so in this particular case, it says, not surprisingly, that the graduate will be able to operate an excavator, excavator operations to lift, carry and place materials. And it basically says that this unit applies to those working in site-based roles. But then it actually does make it clear that there are limits to this unit. So it actually says this unit alone does not provide sufficient skill to independently load and unload equipment. So fundamentally, it is saying that this unit will not enable a person on their own to load the excavator onto a float. They won't be able to do that. They will need another unit of competency. It's called load and unload plant or equipment in order to be able to carry out that role. And indeed, when you look at the elements and performance criteria, you find that it talks about a person. Actually, I think it's covered in the it's covered in the performance evidence. It talks about the person assisting with loading and unloading plant, but it does not enable a person to do that independently. So the application tells you what a person can do, and where it's important, it'll also tell you what a person can't do, certainly can't do in this case on their own. And it'll also refer to licensing and regulatory and legislative and certification requirements. And although it doesn't give you detail, it does remind you that you need to source that information from state jurisdictions prior to applying to this unit and utilising this unit. And so what you see in application is really important information. A lot of people jump right over the application component and go launch straight into the unit of competency. What you need to do is utilise this section to build this understanding of the general content of the unit, the level of sophistication. For example, is the person working autonomously or under supervision? The limitations of their operation, as indeed this does, and the level of autonomy that you expect a person to operate with in terms of the unit. And all of that, the title, the AQF hint, the application, all tell you something about how this unit of competency is ultimately going to be utilised. We're going to take a break in a moment because I want you to have a little look at an activity. But what I want you to do is what I want you to do in that activity is to think about, for about 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so, about how a unit of competency that you teach actually relates to what industry needs. And I'll walk you through that in a moment. But before I do, I should say then after that session, we'll continue with our exploration of the unit of competency. We'll get into the elements and performance criteria, foundation skills, and other components that were in that earlier list. But what I want you to do, and I want you to use this activity to do, is to get you thinking about how industry relates to this unit of competency and how this unit of competency relates to industry. In a sense, I want you to engage the unit with industry, because without that connection, then everything that's said about elements and performance criteria won't have really much meaning. When it talks about foundation skills, it won't have much meaning. When it comes to knowledge, it won't have much meaning unless you can make that real connection between the unit of competency and industry. And we are in vocational education and training. Our links to industry have to be profound and deep. That means that then the units of competency and the qualifications to which they build actually have industrial relevance and support quality performance in the workplace and employment. You should have as a separate document what's described as a mid-session activity. It might be a little bit premature to talk about it as a mid-session activity, because we may be not quite halfway through. But it did seem logical that after we talked about the application, that you now think about the industry component. And so what I want you to do is to take a break and have a look at a unit of competency that you deliver. And I want you to think in terms of what I've got here as 5 questions. First, how does the qualification you teach contribute to safe and productive workplace outcomes? What difference does having the qualification make? And that's the big picture, because we're looking at the qualification. Now look at the unit of competency. How does a unit of competency you teach contribute to effective workplace practices? What workplace tasks does it support? And when you were thinking about that, you were also thinking about tasks that you can use to illustrate the competency for the learning, but also tasks that you might ask a student to do in order to demonstrate the competency in assessment. Does the unit of competency deliver outcomes on its own, or does it work together with other competencies? So in many cases, the unit of competency does not operate functionally and effectively just on its own. So operating an excavator is a fairly straightforward competency. You can imagine it operating on its own, but if you're part of a team which has rollers and graders and other things going on at the same time, then there needs to be a kind of dance, if you like, a kind of symphony of competencies at play. And so you need to think about not just this competency, just the competency you teach, but how that competency connects to other competencies, both within the individual learner, but also the competencies of other people in the workplace. And that might encourage you to think about clustering, where you say, well, these competencies are normally used together. Would it be useful to teach them together? And would it be useful to assess them together? The 4th question is, have you seen the competency you teach actually used in the workplace? I want you now to reflect upon your workplace experience, both in your own career within the workplace, but also now as a vet trainer and assessor. You will have visited workplaces. You do need to visit workplaces in order to understand how the competency you teach actually is expressed in the workplace, how it's actually used in the workplace. And finally, how do you make sure your learners understand that this competency is about the workplace? How do you make an expression within your training, and for that matter your assessment, that this is about the workplace and not about the campus, not about the RTO? It's about the workplace that the RTO and the VET system is supporting. So I'd like you to now just take, if we could reconvene again at about 5 to 11, and that's about 10 minutes from now. And as you work through this, just jot down some ideas. The purpose of this is to get you thinking in a particular way, but if you want to share questions or observations with us through the chat, that would be really good. Let's take a break of 10 minutes. Okay, folks, good to have you back again, and I hope you found that little mid-session activity interesting. It's something with which you should feel very comfortable, but the idea there is to get you to think, if you like, wearing industry shoes or high-vis or whatever industry you're in, to get that sort of sense of setting the unit in context. And that is really important, because now we're going to move into the detail, the minutiae of the unit of competency. And whenever I do this, there's a danger that we'll become focused on the words on the page, not understanding, as we should, that the words on the page are meant to be reflective of what happens in the workplace. Go back to that definition of competency. It's about to the standard of performance required in the workplace. and that is really something that we just can't afford to lose sight of as we go. Our next slide takes us to the fact that some units of competency, and indeed in this training package, in this qualification, there are some units of competency that do have prerequisites. In the particular unit I'm looking at now, which relates to excavator operations, there are no prerequisites. Some units will say prerequisites none. In this case, it doesn't even make a reference to prerequisites at all. It just is silent on that issue. But do keep in mind that if the prerequisite is there, then the unit of competency does not stand alone. It stands upon the shoulders of the prerequisite, and therefore the prerequisite must have been taught either alongside or before the unit of competency, and must have been achieved before you can judge a person to have achieved this unit of competency. And do be careful for the fact that some prerequisites have prerequisites, and indeed you can sometimes find a kind of cascade effect where, although the unit appears to want one prerequisite, you find yourself in a chain of prerequisites going back further and further. These are all part of what it is to be competent, and therefore have to be built into your assessment process. Okay, now let's have a look at the actual detail of what's in the unit of competency. And if we look at the detail of what's in the unit of competency, the first thing we see, of course, next is the element of competency. And the element of competency is the point at which we take the task, which in this case is excavator operations, and break it down into a set of components. Each are called elements of competency. And these elements of competency describe the person, what the person can do. So in the case of this unit of competency, the first element is plan and prepare for excavator operations. It's not surprising that the first one would be to do with that. The second element relates to operate excavator in line with established requirements. The third one is lift, carry and place materials to complete work activity. The fourth one is select, remove and fit attachments. Then the fifth one is prepare to relocate the excavator, which we already know because we've read the application, we can't do on our own. And then finally, conduct housekeeping activities, which is clearing up the area afterwards and reporting faults and the like. Now, those elements of competency are things that the person needs to be able to do. They are describing what the person is doing. But the trouble with these is that they are a little vague. And so to make sure that everybody who is teaching and assessing these elements actually knows what they mean, each element has its own unique set of performance criteria. And indeed, the first element in this particular unit of competency has 8 performance criteria. And it's only when you have seen all 8 of these performance criteria that you can say the person has demonstrated this element of competency. I need to stress here that these performance criteria are not descriptive of the person, they describe the element of competency. So when you've seen these performance criteria, you've seen the element. And it really is important that you understand that, that what we're talking about here is not the bits you assess. You are assessing the elements, but you are looking for the performance criteria to know that the element has actually been seen. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that this is taken up a little bit further. So when we're designing learning strategies and assessment tasks for an element of competency, we need to make sure that when we are teaching it, we teach all the performance criteria together, because they go together, they belong together, and we must assess all the performance criteria for an element together. There's no point in assessing some elements on one day and some performance criteria on one day and other performance criteria with in another task with some other equipment on another day. I mean, if we're making a cake, the ingredients of a cake are its performance criteria. And so either the cake has all of its ingredients, in which case it's a cake, or it's missing something. If it's missing sugar, for example, it's not a cake. it has not, all the performance criteria there are not there. And you can't say, oh, well, I left the sugar out of the cake, but no worries, I put extra sugar in the pizza, that'll make up for it. You can't just treat these ingredients, performance criteria, as separate entities. They belong together to make up the element, must be taught together and must be seen together. That really is important. And one of the things that we often see is that people create a list of performance criteria, even leaving out any reference to the elements. And suddenly you end up with a list of components which don't mean much because they've lost their connection with each other and they've lost their connection with their host element. And so please don't break these elements up. Treat them as entities that must be kept together with their performance criteria. The other thing we have with performance criteria is that they're often written in fairly broad terms and fairly generic terms. And that's because in this particular case, there might be different kind of excavators, there might be different kinds of sites, there might be different kinds of materials that are being being moved. And under those circumstances, you have to write the performance criteria in a kind of generic sense. What you need to do is to be able to contextualize those performance criteria so that they can be understood by learners, understood by observers, in say, an assessment environment, and for that matter, understood by employers who are going to be employing a person who has this unit and has the elements. And that does mean that you may need to change the words of a performance criterion to reflect what happens, what this means within industry. So once again, you need to draw on your industry expertise and say, well, I can read this performance criterion in relation to this element. How would I see this in the workplace? We're back to the workplace again. All of this has to connect to the workplace. And if it doesn't connect to the workplace, then you will have a kind of abstract academic thing going on rather than something that is grounded in workplace application. So the workplace mediates the meaning, if you like, of the performance criteria and the elements, and for that matter, the whole unit. And it really is important that you get that sense of that sort of workplace flavour when you're interpreting these. So although the performance criteria do constitute a kind of checklist of what it is to be competent, it is not as simple as that, because you need to reinterpret these performance criteria in workplace terminology, workplace language, drawing on your current industry skills, so that these now can be recognised in the workplace, understood by learners, understood by employers. And that does mean that different trainers and assessors working with different employers or with different equipment might change slightly the way in which these performance criteria are worded. You will not change the meaning by doing that. You'll just contextualise the wording, if you like, to apply within a particular context. Hence, we use the word contextualisation. You are not leaving things out. You must not leave out a performance criterion any more than you can leave the sugar out of a cake. You can't make that choice. You must address all of the performance criteria, because all of those build to define what that element means, and those elements build to define what that competency means, along with knowledge. So it is important that you understand that you do not vary the number of performance criteria or the meaning of the performance criteria. If a performance criterion does not belong in the element, because sometimes when they write them, they don't write them all that very well, or if the performance criterion is very rare or very expensive or very dangerous, or for some reason or other hard for you to observe, then you may have to seek some way of getting to that performance criterion in a different way. It might be like substituting sugar for with an artificial sweetener. Although I might say, by the way, that sugar has characteristics like caramelization, which an artificial sweetener won't. So it'll depend a lot on the function of the performance criterion and how it contributes to the overall performance of the element. But it is possible that you may find that a performance criterion simply is inaccessible. And under those circumstances, you can argue that you could ask a what-if question. So it might be that the performance requirement is that they demonstrate the use of this equipment in very wet conditions. If there's a drought on and you can't artificially create very wet conditions, you might have to ask the question, what if I was doing this in the middle of a thunderstorm? What would I be doing? How would this be different if I was utilizing this machinery in swampy conditions? What I'm getting at here is the what if question can be asked, but only when it is rare, expensive, dangerous, seasonal sometimes, and you can't get any other way to it. Sometimes too, you'll find a performance criterion is just simply doesn't belong. And in those circumstances, you need to go to your SSO to find out whether or not you can modify or ignore that particular aspect. Whichever way you go in these things, you must be prepared to defend the judgment you made, because fundamentally you can't modify a unit of competency in terms of its requirements or an element of competency in terms of its performance criteria. You must stick to the script. But if it becomes impossible, then you must look at ways of addressing that to make sure that you haven't created a sense that a person is competent when they are in fact not. That could be dangerous. So I want you to always keep in mind that through your workplace experience and your industry skills, look for ways in which you can find a task or an activity that enables you to see all of the performance criteria for an element. And then if you can't find that, then look for a way of plugging the gaps so that there's no misunderstanding about what this element and ultimately this competency really involves. One thing that competency might involve, though, is our foundation skills, which are our next slide. And on the most part, foundation skills will be addressed through the requirements of the performance criteria. And under those circumstances, what you'll find is that the performance criteria will tell you everything you need to know about the fundamentals of performance in relation to the unit. In this particular unit of competency I'm looking at here, most of the foundation skills that might apply are addressed within the performance criteria, but there are two, one relating to reading and one relating to numeracy, which the writers of the training package and of this unit of competency feel are not adequately covered by the performance criteria, so they've written them in as extra requirements. They are in fact extra skills. So one of them is numeracy, which says uses equipment operating capacity schedule to confirm safe weight load limits, load limits. Now, fundamentally, what it's saying is, well, it's part of being an excavator operator. It's not picked up clearly in a performance criterion, so we'll write it in as an extra foundation skill. That extra foundation skill has to be assessed like the elements of performance criteria have to be assessed. It is part of being a skilled operator. There's also one that relates to reading, identifies and interprets information from workplace procedures, documentation, legislation, and regulations. So that's basically saying that most of the things that an excavator operator doesn't involve reading, but there are some things that do. We haven't picked them up well in the performance criteria, so we're going to write them in as foundation skills. The training package writers have been sometimes very disciplined about that. I think in this case they have been. They've looked at the performance criteria. They've said, is there anything else in terms of skills we need to say? And they've written them in as foundation skills. Others are a little bit less disciplined, and so you'll find some training packages where they have long lists of foundation skills which they've mapped to performance criteria, thus proving that they don't need to be mapped, because if they're already covered by performance criteria, you do not need to list them as separate entities. So you'll find that some people and some training packages do a good job of this, others don't. Whichever way it goes, you need to know that any foundation skill that is listed has been assessed somewhere. A person can't be competent in this unit of competency unless they've demonstrated all the elements and hence their performance criteria and all the foundation skills that are listed. That does mean you need to make sure that that's built into your assessment process. Some units of competency have a range of conditions. This particular unit of competency does not, but it's within the structure of the current modern so-called streamlined unit of competency format that a range of conditions can be included. This is a little bit of a throwback to the previous format of units of competency, but what it does do is tell you what specific words and requirements mean. So it'll actually take a particular component of a performance criterion, for example, and say this particular equipment might include, or typically would include, or kinds of materials might include. That might be also picked up later on in performance evidence. But in some training packages and some units of competency, range of conditions is added. And if you see that, then you need to make sure that that becomes part of your planning in terms of delivery and part of your planning in terms of assessment. So we find ourselves finished with this document. There is one other thing which talks about unit mapping, and we'll come back to that near the very end, where it talks about whether or not this unit has any equivalent counterparts. But we'll go now to the second document, which really should have been part of the first, which are the assessment requirements. And there are some bits of it which are assessment requirements, such as performance evidence, but there are other bits of it, such as the knowledge evidence, which is just a fundamental requirement of competency. Competency is, you'll remember, skills and knowledge. We've seen skills already in terms of foundation skills and elements of competency. Within this document, you'll find the knowledge component. But it almost always starts with performance evidence. And performance evidence will tell you useful information about the way in which you can observe performance of the elements of competency. And so you'll find in this particular document, it talks about carrying out work activities on at least 2 occasions. So at least 2 occasions means that one assessment, one observation of the person using the excavator will not be adequate. There needs to be 2. Further on, it says using at least two different material types. So now tell us that it's not working with the same materials twice, it's working with one set of materials and a different set of materials. So that you can then see, for example, consistency, which is part of the definition of competency, and you can also see transfer. Have they been able to transfer the skills in operating with this set of materials to a different set of materials? It doesn't ask for anything more than that, so 2 assessments of the elements and performance criteria will be sufficient. But it says at least 2 because you might need to make more observations to be confident of consistency or to be confident of transfer. And so it says at least rather than only because it's encouraging you to make sure you get sufficient evidence. Remember, that's one of the rules of evidence, that you have sufficient evidence. They are saying that in most circumstances, 2 observations will be sufficient evidence. But you as a trainer and assessor, drawing on your expertise in terms of industry, need to ask yourself the question, have I got enough evidence with these two assessments to be able to safely say this person is going to be able to consistently perform this competency and to be able to transfer it? And if you feel that you don't have enough evidence, then go for a third. It goes on then and provides a lot of information. And indeed, in this one, they've been a little bit laborious and tedious because they've got a heading which says, in the course of the above work, the candidate must also, and then it has a list of about 20 items, most of which map onto performance criteria exactly, word for word, which means that they've just repeated the performance criteria again. But you need to go through that list very carefully, because sometimes they'll pop in a quality that is not a performance criterion, in which case it's an extra additional skill. And so, for example, when it talks about carry out vehicle refueling requirements and procedures where applicable, that is not mentioned in the performance criteria. So straight away you recognise that I need to assess more than the performance criteria, because that particular item is not covered by performance criteria. So what you need to do is to make sure that you go through the performance evidence and make sure that everything is being covered somewhere, and if it isn't, add to your assessment processes to make sure that those components are covered. All of the performance evidence must have been assessed. When you declare a person to be competent, you are saying they've got all of the elements and performance criteria, all of the foundation skills, met any range of conditions, met all the performance evidence. You are saying all of those things. But more, you're also saying that they've demonstrated or provided evidence that they have all of the knowledge. And that takes us to the next part of the unit of competency, which is the knowledge evidence. When we look at knowledge, we have a little bit of a dilemma. Not only is it parked sort of in the back of the document as almost an afterthought, a lot of people treat the knowledge as some kind of separate entity rather than being something that is intimately connected with and integrated with the unit of competency. And part of the way in which you deal with that is to remind yourself, as it does in the document, that the candidate must be able to demonstrate knowledge to complete the tasks outlined in the elements and performance criteria of this unit. In other words, the fundamental function of knowledge is to support the elements of competency. In our game, knowledge is the servant of skills. We need to have knowledge in order to be able to be effective workers with the skills. And so when it comes to knowledge, keep asking yourself for each item of knowledge, how does this help the person? What knowledge does a person need to help them perform the tasks that have been set in the elements of competency and their performance criteria? What knowledge does a person need to have to function effectively within industry? Those questions will help you to decipher what is required. Quite often, the thing might be just a couple of words, like there's an item of knowledge here called isolation requirements. Is that talking about COVID? No, it's not talking about COVID. It must be talking about something else. Isolation requirements, what does that mean within the context of this task, of these skills, of this role as an excavator operator within real workplaces? What does isolation requirements mean? And just those two words you've got to take apart and understand in terms of the elements of competency and in terms of the workplace. So there's a fairly long list here. Some units of competency have enormously long lists of knowledge. Others have fairly short lists of knowledge. But the key thing you need to understand is that function of that knowledge in supporting the elements of competency. Those items of knowledge help a person understand how tasks work. It means that they are not just mindlessly performing a task, but they're performing a task understanding the knowledge that lies behind that task. That means that when things go wrong, they can modify the task in order to cope with contingencies. And that really, really is important, that if you don't understand what the systems with which you're working, then when things go wrong, you'll just fall in a heap. You won't be able to deal with it in any meaningful way. If you have an understanding, you'll be able to think about workarounds, you'll be able to think about what needs to be fixed, you'll need to be able to report effectively on what went wrong and why. So knowledge becomes really important in coping with the uncertainties, with the contingencies of real workplaces. And real workplaces don't operate just smoothly and efficiently and effectively. Things do go wrong, they're complex. Knowledge will also help a person take learnings from this unit to other units of competency. Lots of units of competency share the same knowledge base. So you can see that knowledge forges a link between one competency and another competency. It also enables a person to take a competency and apply it within other workplaces. You may not be able to assess across all of the range of conditions because of where you're located and the equipment you have and the resources you have available to you. So you can use knowledge to inform and prepare a learner for other areas of work, other conditions, other environments, other equipment. You can't afford to have necessarily every possible brand of excavator on site, but you can use knowledge to enable a person to learn, to transfer the learnings in relation to this brand of excavator to another brand of excavator or to another model of the same brand. The thing about it is that enables a person to transfer the learnings which have been acquired and demonstrated in one particular context to other times and other workplaces. In other words, the knowledge enhances industry understanding. So you need to have that knowledge as a trainer and assessor. You need to build that knowledge into your training and assessment, your training delivery, and you need to look for that knowledge in your assessment processes. So far from being some sort of second-rate component in a unit of competency, knowledge is really vital. But what it does mean is that you're going to need to make sure that you link that knowledge into and integrate that knowledge into the skills components by making sure that there is harmony and consistency between the two. So the next slide takes up on some of those things I've just said, which is knowledge is often not very well specified. You need to think about how it underpins performance of the elements, and you need to think about how the knowledge is used in the workplace. That word workplace, I know it's driving you mad because I keep coming back to it. But if you keep that reference in your mind, as you did in the little activity, then all of a sudden it becomes clear not just what knowledge is needed, but also what knowledge is not needed. I mean, each of these items of knowledge could be a whole course in themselves. You know, there's something on ground conditions. Well, ground conditions could be a vast amount of information and material, but we're talking about ground conditions in relation to operating an excavator. We suddenly start putting boundaries to and limits to what the knowledge is going to involve. And so it becomes really important that you think about it in those terms. And finally, you need to think about the scope and range of knowledge that you will need to teach and assess. Although it might only refer to one thing in the knowledge, there might be facets to the knowledge, which means you need to ask more than one question on each bit of knowledge. Now, I've been asked a question to test my knowledge from Haley Fletcher. Is the contingency management dimension adequately assessed through knowledge assessment, or is it best to ask specific contingency or what-if questions in that assessment? I think I would want to comment on that in two ways. One is that the best way to measure a person's ability to cope with contingency is to look for contingencies happening in the real world. If you're using a simulation, you know, an on-campus simulation for assessment, then set your simulations up so things go wrong and you can observe how a person reacts to those contingencies. If it's in a real workplace, those contingencies might not happen, or if they do happen, you might have to wait a very long time to see them, in which case you can assess those as knowledge questions. So I would think that if you're using simulation, you can set up contingencies to test a person's ability to cope with contingencies. But if you're assessing in a workplace, it's most likely you're going to have to ask the kind of what-if question, so that you can say, well, what if this bit of plant goes down? What happens if the hydraulics on this cease to operate effectively, whatever? I'm a bit outside my field when I start talking about excavator operations. So what I'm getting at here is that you may have to go to knowledge in order to establish that they've got a coverage of contingency. But whenever you can, particularly if you're setting up a simulation and are therefore in control of what happens, you can build the contingency assessment into the actual process of assessment itself. How they cope with contingency then will be a function of their skill and of their knowledge, and that will tell you a lot about how well they are prepared for the real world. After knowledge evidence, we come to the last part of the unit of competency, which are the assessment conditions. And the assessment conditions are there, as it would suggest, to describe the sort of circumstances under which assessment could take place. I just mentioned in response to that question simulation. And it may indicate in the assessment conditions that assessment has to happen in the workplace, in which case simulation is not a legitimate alternative for you to use. But it might say, as indeed this one does, that where personal safety or environmental damage are limiting factors, assessment may occur in a simulated work environment. So what they're basically saying is it needs to happen with real equipment, with real excavator, real attachments, real PPE, must be conducted in a safe environment, must be assessed in a work environment, must be assessed in an environment that meets with regulatory and legislative requirements, and that's a big ask, getting all those things together. And so then it goes on to say, well, if you can't do all of that, then a simulation would be legitimate. But then it goes on with some hard words. It says, first of all, the simulation must be realistic and sufficiently rigorous to cover all aspects of the sector's workplace performance, including, it says, and here it picks up the dimensions of competency, and I think that's quite clever thinking, including task skills. That is, they have to be driving a real excavator. They can't just be sitting behind a desk making engine noises, pretending to drive an excavator. It has to be a real excavator. And so they are actually pulling the levers and operating the equipment, because there's a visceral component to driving an excavator. It moves, it makes noise, there are all sorts of things going on. All your senses are involved. A simulator machine might be useful as a teaching tool, but it's not likely to be good as an assessment tool. So that kind of simulator is not likely to give you the real sense of the task skills. It then talks about task management skills. So when you're driving the excavator, you're dealing with a whole range of other things simultaneously. You have to be able to coordinate a whole range of sometimes competing requirements. You might have to prioritize particular components of the task. You have to plan and think ahead. And so the task management is really important. So your simulation has to involve that. Contingency management skills basically means things can go wrong. In the real workplace, things might go wrong in ways that are unpredictable. If it's a simulation, you have to build predictability into the process. And job role environment skills means that, which is the final dimension of competency, and it's listed here in this document, is basically saying that real work involves, pressure of time, economies of effort, other people involved in the processes around you. You may have to pause your excavation operations while something else happens. What I'm getting at here is that the real workplace is a confused and somewhat chaotic environment, which you have to replicate in your simulation. So it's saying, well, you can use a simulation, but by golly, it needs to be a good one. It needs to be so like real work that when a person succeeds in performing in the simulation, you know they will perform also effectively in a real workplace situation. If your simulation is so beautifully contrived and controlled that nothing will ever go wrong, it'll be sweet in the sense that it's sort of a classic piece of performance of the task, you're not reflecting what real workplaces are like. And under those circumstances, you are not going to be able to make a meaningful judgment that this person is work ready. And that's what you have to be able to do. When you go back to the application of this competency, it said that at completion of this unit, the person will be able to operate an excavator in civil construction, on a civil construction site. And that's where you have to be with your simulation. You have to have that sort of strength. Then in this document, and under assessment conditions, there's a whole page on assessor requirements. And it basically is saying that the assessors have to meet certain standards. Most of the standards that they list here are actually part of the standards for RTOs. In other words, most of them map to 113A, that is, a person has vocational competence, or 113B, which says you have current industry skills, or 113C, which says you have vet skills and knowledge, current vet skills and knowledge, or 114, which means you're a qualified trainer and assessor. So most of them map to that, but some of them don't. So, for example, on this particular document here, it provides you with an indication that if you're going to be assessing at Certificate 3 level, you must have had 3 years experience within within the drilling, coal mining, extractive, quarrying, metalliferous mining, or civil infrastructure world. And if you haven't had 3 years experience, you can't assess this unit of competency because it's a Certificate 3 unit. I might say, by the way, that at Certificate 1 level, you only have had to have had 1 year of experience. At Certificate 2 level units, you need to have had 2 years of experience. And this little table down here says not anyone can be an assessor. Even if you've worked in the environment, you need to have worked enough time to be able to assess this unit of competency because it's at AQF 3 level. And I guess what it's saying, if you think about it, is if you've not yourself practiced as an autonomous, skilled operator within the context of excavator operations for a significant period of time, how can you be reasonably expected to make a judgment that an individual is ready for that role? So you can see that in this particular case, the unit of competency is very explicit and quite demanding about who can be an assessor and who is not yet ready to be an assessor. It also talks about the fact that if you don't meet all of these requirements, you can engage the assistance of someone who does. So it does also say it's also acceptable for the appropriately qualified assessor to work with an industry expert who has the necessary experience to both plan the assessment and conduct the assessment and ultimately make the assessment judgment. So they give a strategy for dealing with people who are still in the process of building up that experience. On the final page, it links you back to the implementation guide and the companion volume, and provides you with a link that enables you to go straight to it. Well, not quite straight to it, but you'll get there eventually. It provides information about simulated environments. Indeed, this document here does have, I didn't spot it, but it must have, because it says it does, a discussion about simulation. So it takes the sort of things that I was saying there in terms of the dimensions of competency and talks about them within the context of resources and infrastructure industry. It has a second asterisk point which talks about how assessors can demonstrate work experience. And it says that that's within industry to a role relevant to the outcomes of this unit. And I do need to stress here that when it talks about 3 years experience in the industry, it's not saying 3 years as a trainer. It's saying 3 years as a worker. We have to be very careful here because from time to time you find people saying, when they're talking about their industry experience, they say, oh, I've got a lot of industry experience. I've been teaching in vet for 20 years. That is not industry experience. It is experience in the vet industry, but it's not experience in this case in the resources and infrastructure industry. And what they're talking about here is time on the job. And of course, that's part of the process of recruiting and employing trainers and assessors. It's also something that you need to work on with your current industry skills and your vocational competence. And so what kicks in there is PD, your professional development, and you're sustaining your expertise, and the way in which the RTO makes sure that the right expertise is drawn together to carry out the assessment function. You'll notice that it's almost all about assessment there, not about training. And you'll notice that that's the sort of thing you find again in the standards, where it basically is very precise and prescriptive about what's involved in assessment, a little less so what's involved when it comes to training. The third dot point on this page, one I've referred to already, where it makes reference to the fact that the unit doesn't have an AQF level, but it has an AQF hint, which enables you to understand a little bit about the level of sophistication that's expected of a person doing this unit, but that's also relevant to the level of experience that the trainer needs to have, or beg your pardon, the assessor needs to have if they're going to be assessing the outcomes of this unit. So you can see the assessment conditions are really rich with information. Sometimes they're quite brief, sometimes they simply say, it has to be done in the workplace or it can be done in a simulation. They don't talk very much about it. Sometimes they're very detailed and they talk about specific equipment and tools and materials and other players in the assessment process, such as supervisors and other team members. And sometimes when it comes to assessors, they just say assessors need to meet standards 113 through to 116 of the standards for RTOs. And another time, such as in this one, they've been very prescriptive and very precise about what assessors need to do. Again, this is an area of variation between training packages. I'll leave you to look at yours to make a judgment as to how much detail is there and how much you need to comply with. Of course, the assessment requirements is not about the student. So you're not actually assessing the student on the assessment requirements. They're about the requirements of the assessment process. So you wouldn't necessarily map the assessment requirements, except if you wanted to say, yes, we are using this equipment, yes, we are using those materials, but that's most likely to be something that pops up in performance evidence. We have another question, and if I might move to one side. What happened to attitude in competency? Is assumed competent, and yes, it's an interesting question. In the traditional old-fashioned frameworks, we had what were called taxonomies, a taxonomy of knowledge, which I think most people would know of as Bloom's taxonomy of knowledge. We had a taxonomy of skills, and we had a taxonomy of attitudes. And you might feel that attitudes have been left out of this exercise. Attitudes are very much implicit, but not explicit within the standards. So it may well talk about, safety. It may well talk about efficiency. It may well talk about effective communication. All of these things talk to or speak to in some way to attitude. But there is an argument that attitude needs to be more explicitly incorporated in these units of competency. But you'll notice the definition of competency doesn't mention attitude. It just talks about skills and knowledge. And I think that's probably as far as it's going to go. Attitudes might become part of an employment understanding, but they're not part of what we are doing within this, except when they're kind of implicit within the way in which something is worded. But they're certainly not sought or defined in any formal sense. My personal opinion is that attitudes could be incorporated, but what would have to happen if we're talking about competencies is we would have to define performances, behaviours that were evidence of the attitude. In other words, to stick to the competency concept, these would have to be something that you could get evidence for. And I might say that sometimes if you write an attitude and define the behaviours that constitute the attitude, then at the end of the day, the person can either fake the behaviours, in other words, they can appear to be pleasant and nice and to customers, even though they don't like them. But that doesn't matter, because being pleasant and nice to customers makes customers feel nice. Or they will internalise those behaviours and it will become part of their attitude set. Either way, it can be incorporated. And you will find from time to time, when it's, say, talking about customer relations, that that attitudes will come in as part of the subtext to those performance criteria. Now let's look at a couple of sort of other issues. These other issues are really significant, because training packages can't be all things to all industry. There are various reasons for that. One is that industry will move and change, and there'll be new equipment, new protocols, new processes, and to a large extent, training packages will always lag a little bit behind what is happening in industry. Therein lies a problem for you as trainers and assessors, because you'll be conscious of the fact that industry has moved on, and yet you have to teach and assess to the standard required of the training package. And I understand that that can be very frustrating. It doesn't mean you can't teach them, but it does mean you can't assess those new protocols and processes, because to do so would be to invalidate your assessments. You can teach them because you can alert students to that, and indeed the implementation guide talks about looking to the future. So it's aware of the fact that sometimes the future hasn't arrived yet, but we do know what's coming, and it's worth talking about with our students. But what we can't do is teach as if we were in the future. And that does mean that training packages always are a little bit behind the scene. And it takes many years for a training package to be revised and approved and implemented. And even then, as you will know, that there is a period of time when they're transitioning. So that we can be talking many years in terms of a training package making changes. But we have a more dynamic process, which is called accreditation. And it does mean that within the industry can say, we need a course on something new that is not being covered by a training package. It might be not being covered by a training package because it's a niche area of industry and it didn't get much of a voice when the training package was written. Or it might be because it's a new component of industry and its voice has not yet been heard by the training package. Either way, industry with those concerns and those needs can seek to have a course accredited. The Training Accreditation Council is one of 3 agencies in Australia that can accredit a course. And as soon as a course is accredited, which would be a new qualification with a new title or a new skill set, or maybe just a single unit, or just a course of some kind, which doesn't necessarily have an AQF level. Once that is accredited, then it becomes nationally recognised. It can be certificated under the national recognition system, and it meets, it meets in its definition specific standards in terms of the industry engagement, and the expression of the standard through something which is like a training package. In fact, in lots of ways, it goes further than a training package, because when a course is accredited, we actually ask people to talk about training and trainers and training delivery, whereas the training package does not talk about training, it talks about assessment primarily. It very rarely speaks to training, but the implementation guide might. So what you have is a situation where we can respond quickly to changes in industry, and so we can respond to needs within industry which will maybe never reflected in a training package because it's seen as a kind of peripheral area of activity. So these accredited courses go through a review process, and the review process primarily looks at has there been proper industry engagement and consultation in the process. Most of the time, these new qualifications come from industry itself, but sometimes they come from RTOs working with industry, because industry is not always fully au fait with how it needs to go about turning an industry need into a course of learning and assessment. So we asked the first question, which is how well has this been researched, and how well are the requirements in terms of competencies defined. And so the accredited course may include competencies that already exist, but can be put together in a combination which can't be covered by a training package, or it may involve competencies which are created as brand new competencies that have never existed before, which are now being created for the purposes of this accredited course. And indeed, under very special and rare circumstances, if it's not so much a competency as simply a knowledge base, within Western Australia, the accredited course could include what are called modules, which are not competencies, do not conform to the competency format, and have quite a different function. Now, that's a whole other topic, and we're not going to go into that now, but what you can see is that we can be incredibly flexible and responsive, both in terms of time and content and form, to make sure that there are nationally recognised courses available in any part of industry and any developing a new area of industry. And indeed, in some circumstances, those accredited courses get swallowed up by the next version of the training package, and so they become part of the impetus towards change. Once a course is accredited, then it can only be delivered by an RTO that has that accredited course on its scope. So there is a level of control in terms of the quality of delivery, because only an RTO can deliver it. And the owner of the course, that is the people who created the course, can retain control over that course. They can determine who they will allow to deliver the course, maybe through some sort of franchise process. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they say, go for it, but the organisation will still need to be an RTO that was able to demonstrate that it was prepared to meet the requirements of that accredited course. So we have that as a really useful component. So when we talk today about training packages, we're not talking about the whole scene. To complete the scene, we need to see that there are these accredited courses as well. The second thing that we want to touch on before we finish today is scope. And here we just want to reflect on the fact that scope is carefully defined to make sure that you as an RTO are ready and capable of delivering a defined field of training and assessment. And so you may have a specific units of competency listed in your scope, in which case we think about that as explicit scope, and these are the competencies you can deliver. We also have implicit scope, which basically says, well, you've been accredited to deliver this qualification. And there are, within this qualification, a whole bunch of units. And so there is implicit scope in the sense that because this qualification involves those units, you have within your scope the ability to deliver these units. I might want to stress, however, though, that when it says a unit of competency from another training package, don't just assume that that means that you have scope to deliver everything you like, because it's possible to do it in that way. No, we're talking about listed units of competency rather than that sort of throwaway phrase which enables you to deliver, to include as electives units from other training packages. You would need to establish that you had the capacity to deliver those. And there might be standalone units from your scope that you can deliver. So you can deliver these as part of a qualification, or you could deliver these as standalone units. So you could, for example, run a course on excavator operations as a standalone unit. So scope is something you need to watch. We also need to watch out in terms of transitioning. And this is a quite complex slide. And so what I want to do with this, at this point, is to take the cards way out, which is to say there's a fact sheet called Transition and Teach Out. And the fact sheet picks up on these precise points. There's a lot to think about here. And indeed, for us to go through that now in this detail is probably not going to be helpful. It's probably more useful for you to go to the fact sheet where you can sit and think about the circumstances that apply to a particular situation. But there are differences between a unit that has been superseded by an equivalent, or not necessarily equivalent, by another or a substitute unit, if let's put it that way, a substitute unit, to what you can do if the unit is absolutely removed or deleted and no longer exists. There isn't even a substitute unit for it. And so the rules that apply in terms of transition and teach out are different to when there is another unit to which your students could migrate versus the lack of another unit to which your students could go. So you need to, in fact, read the transition and teach out fact sheet, and how you respond in terms of transitioning will depend very much upon whether it's 1 year or 2 years for teach out. And transition well, it won't be transition if the product is deleted. There's nothing to transition to. We also can see that when we look at these, that sometimes a unit is superseded and the new unit is created, and the old unit is then declared to be equivalent or non-equivalent. It's unambiguous if it's not equivalent. If the old unit is not equivalent, then the new unit and the old unit have no formal relationship with each other, and there is nothing that can be gained from having the old unit in relation to the new unit. When it's declared as equivalent, though, we run into some troubles. We run into some problems. And one of the problems may well be that the people who declared the new unit and the old unit to be equivalent to each other actually haven't really done a careful analysis of what it means. You'll notice that it talks about, from the training package products policy, that equivalent should only apply when the outcomes of the old and new units are equivalent. That is, they are the same outcomes, even though the way the units are worded might be slightly different. If the outcomes are the same, then they could be called equivalent. But when you closely look at two units which are declared to be equivalent to each other, when you closely look at them, you sometimes find that it's not true, that the outcomes are not actually the same. And so even though the training package says it's equivalent, you have to know as a trainer and assessor that they're not really. So it's really critically important that you don't take at face value the declaration of equivalence, that you actually get in there and map the difference between the old unit and the new unit, because that will impact on how you can use this concept of equivalence. In our penultimate slide, we will make a reference to the fact that if they truly are the same, then you can think about whether or not this unit could be used as a prerequisite or for credit or to meet qualification packaging rules. Because in the previous slide it said that it would apply to workplace contexts, yes, and to AQF qualification purposes, which would be this. But you really need to know that it's been just perhaps a title change. I mean, sometimes it's just a code change. But if it isn't, then they are not going to be sufficiently the same to be used in this way, and you'll be making a risky decision because there may be gaps in the person's background in terms of the former version of the unit of competency, which will not be understood in relation to the future. So you need to do mappings. You need to deal with this very carefully and thoughtfully. The old unit might provide some evidence that, after all, the old unit has been assessed by an RTO, meeting, one presumes, the standards of assessment against the unit of competency. That possibly means that there's some meaningful evidence that in the achievement of the old unit that could be transferred into the new unit in order to carry out an RPL process. But your mapping will tell you what the differences were, and you'd need to make sure you assess the differences, keeping in mind, of course, that that does not operate at a performance criterion level because they can never be broken up into bits. And the final point of this slide is that you must never assume that the materials you developed in terms of training materials and assessment resources for the superseded unit will simply plop across and be used in the new unit. Again, you must do the mapping, you must do the analysis and find out what the differences are and make sure those differences are reflected in your training and in your assessment processes. What you certainly cannot do is award the new unit on the basis of the old unit. That is simply not possible for you to do because they're not the same unit. They have changed in some way. You need to find out what those changes are through mapping and then accommodate those changes in your teaching and in your assessment processes and in the choices that you make. So we would want you to be very careful when it comes to equivalence, that you are very mindful of the risks associated with that process and that you make sure that at no stage do you compromise the standards of the training package or the units of competency within it through that process. Well, we do have a slide which says questions, but I think we probably can't really deal with that. This is probably a more face-to-face environment. So I'll just draw your attention to references and resources. And I do need to stress to you that the standards for RTOs are, of course, the fundamental resource, and there is also a guide, a user guide to the standards. The design model for streamlined training packages talks about the way in which training packages are put together. The amount of training for TAC fact sheet talks about how you interpret a training package and units of competency and the nature and characteristics of your students to determine how much training is going to be involved. All of these fact sheets, there are many of them here, and some DTWD publications and the like, and of course the training.gov website. All of these will contribute to, as resources to you interpreting and working effectively with training packages. And the final slide is to basically remind you that TAC is the kind of regulator that believes that one of its primary roles is to support quality. So if you have further questions, you can put them to TAC. TAC may well direct your questions on, but the case managers in TAC are experts and can provide you with meaningful advice or direct you to a resource where you can get meaningful advice in relation to these. And of course, keep in mind that there are podcasts, workshops that have been recorded, and a whole suite of fact sheets and other publications that you can access through the TAC website. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you for your participation. Lovely to know that you are there, and all the best with in your work with training packages and units of competency.